The whispers cut deeper than any knife ever could. Violet Reed clutched her handkerchief to her mouth, hot tears streaming silently down her flushed cheeks as she sat alone in the last pew of Crimson Creek's only church. It was May of 1872, and the Sunday morning congregation had plenty to gossip about with Violet's sudden return to town after 5 years away. The sermon had ended 15 minutes ago, but Violet couldn't bring herself to leave, knowing the gauntlet of judgmental stares waiting outside. The remaining parishioners gathered in small clusters, their hushed voices barely concealing words like scandal and disgrace as they glanced back at her. "Well, I heard she was living with Indians," a woman in a garish purple bonnet stage whispered. "Probably has savage ways now." "My cousin in Denver said she was working in one of those houses where proper ladies don't set foot," another added with obvious relish. Violet pressed her handkerchief harder against her trembling lips. None of it was true. She'd spent 5 years teaching at a girls' school in Boston, trying to forget the heartbreak that drove her from Crimson Creek. But truth rarely stood a chance against a good scandal. The church door creaked open, letting in a shaft of bright sunlight that momentarily blinded her. A tall silhouette filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and unmistakably masculine. The whispers intensified as boots thudded heavily against the wooden floor. Violet kept her head down, hoping whoever had entered would conduct their business and leave her to her misery. Instead, the footsteps approached her pew, and a man slid onto the bench beside her. "Folks around here still haven't learned when to hold their tongues, I see," a deep voice said quietly. Violet turned, startled by both the proximity and the familiar drawl. Her breath caught in her throat as she found herself looking into the weathered face of Kieran O'Malley. He'd changed in the years since she'd last seen him. The boyish features had hardened into those of a man. A scar ran along his jawline that hadn't been there before, and the skin around his hazel eyes had creased from years squinting in the sun. His dark hair was longer now, curling slightly beneath the brim of his Stetson. "Mr. O'Malley," she managed, quickly wiping away her tears. "I didn't know you were still in Crimson Creek." "Most days I'm not," he replied, his gaze fixed on the church's modest altar. "Range work keeps me moving, just happened to be passing through." Violet nodded, acutely aware of the heightened whispers. Kieran O'Malley had his own reputation in town, a skilled horseman and occasional peacekeeper who'd ridden with the Texas Rangers for a spell before returning to Colorado. Some called him a hero, others said he was dangerous. All agreed he wasn't a man to cross. "You shouldn't pay them any mind, Miss Reed," he said, nodding toward the gossiping parishioners. "Most haven't had an original thought in decades." Despite herself, Violet felt a smile tug at her lips. "You always did speak your mind, Mr. O'Malley." "Kieran," he corrected. "Think we're past formalities, considering our history." Their history. 5 years ago, they'd been young and foolish, stealing kisses behind her father's barn. Until the day she'd found him embracing Sarah Williams by the creek, and her heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces. 2 weeks later, she'd boarded a train east without saying goodbye. "I should go," Violet said, suddenly uncomfortable with the memories flooding back. "My aunt is expecting me." "Let me walk you," Kieran offered, standing and extending his hand. "Give them something real to talk about." Violet hesitated, then placed her gloved hand in his calloused one. As they walked toward the exit, the whispers grew silent, replaced by wide-eyed stares. Kieran nodded politely to Reverend Collins, who looked as though he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Outside, the May sunshine was brilliant against a cloudless Colorado sky. Crimson Creek sprawled before them, a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, telegraph poles, and hitching posts where horses patiently waited for their owners. "I heard you were back to care for your aunt," Kieran said as they descended the church steps. "Yes, Aunt Martha's health is failing. I couldn't let her face it alone. Kind of you to come, considering the reception you're getting," Violet shrugged. "Family is family." They walked in silence for a moment, passing the general store where Mr. Hollister swept the boardwalk. He nodded at Kieran but eyed Violet with suspicion. "Don't worry about old Hollister," Kieran said. "He's suspicious of anyone who's seen the world beyond county lines." "I spent 5 years in Boston, not sailing the 7 seas," Violet replied with a small laugh. "Might as well be the same to folks around here." Kieran adjusted his hat against the sun. "Teaching at a girls' school, right?" Violet looked at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "I make it my business to separate fact from fiction," he said simply. They reached the corner where the road forked one path leading to town, the other to the modest homes on the outskirts where Violet's aunt lived. "I can find my way from here," Violet said, withdrawing her hand from his arm. Kieran studied her face for a moment. "I'm heading out to the Preston Ranch tomorrow, got some work that'll keep me there a few weeks, but I'd like to call on you properly when I return if you'd allow it." Violet felt her heart quicken. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because 5 years is a long time to wonder if you made the biggest mistake of your life," he answered, his voice low. "And because those gossiping fools back there don't know the first thing about you, Violet Reed. Never did." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and strode toward the livery stable, leaving her breathless and confused on the dusty corner. Aunt Martha was waiting on the porch when Violet arrived, her thin frame rocking steadily in the old chair that had belonged to Violet's grandfather. "Saw you walking with young O'Malley," the older woman observed, her eyes sharp despite her failing health. "Tongues will be wagging about that." "They were already wagging," Violet sighed, settling onto the porch step. "I can't win in this town, Aunt Martha." "Never tried to win," her aunt replied pragmatically. "Just tried to live. There's a difference." Inside the small house, Violet prepared a simple lunch while her aunt dozed. Her mind kept returning to Kieran's words. 5 years was indeed a long time, and she wasn't the naive girl who'd fled town with a broken heart anymore. What had Kieran meant about making the biggest mistake of his life? As far as she knew, he and Sarah Williams had courted for some time after Violet left. The engagement announcement had reached her in Boston during her 2nd year away. Yet there'd been no wedding announcement to follow, and Kieran had obviously not settled down with a wife. Over the next days, Violet fell into a rhythm caring for her aunt and trying to ignore the town's persistent gossip. She ventured to the general store for supplies and to the post office to send letters to her former employers in Boston. Each trip earned her cold stares and whispered comments. On Thursday morning, a knock at the door revealed Mrs. Preston, wife of the rancher who employed Kieran. "Miss Reed," the older woman greeted her stiffly. "I've come to speak with you about a delicate matter." Violet invited her inside, offering tea which Mrs. Preston declined. "I'll be direct," the woman said, perched on the edge of Aunt Martha's best chair. "My husband has hired Kieran O'Malley to break some new horses. Good man, reliable worker, but I understand he's shown an interest in you." Violet felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Preston, let me finish," the woman interrupted. "You've been gone a long time, Miss Reed. Things have happened that you don't know about. Kieran O'Malley deserves a fresh start with someone untainted by this town's history." "Untainted," Violet echoed, anger rising in her chest. "I mean no offense," Mrs. Preston continued, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But your sudden departure and the rumors that followed were just that." "Rumors," Violet said firmly. Mrs. Preston sighed. "Nevertheless, people remember, and Kieran has suffered enough because of the Reed family." "What do you mean?" asked your aunt, Mrs. Preston said, rising to leave. "Just consider what I've said. Good day, Miss Reed." After the door closed behind her visitor, Violet stormed to her aunt's bedroom. "What did she mean? Kieran suffered because of our family?" Aunt Martha sighed deeply. "Sit down, child. There are things you should know." The story her aunt told left Violet shaking. 2 months after she'd left for Boston, her father had accused Kieran of stealing horses from their property. The accusation had nearly gotten Kieran hanged. Only the last-minute testimony of a ranch hand who admitted to the theft had saved him. By then, Kieran's reputation had been severely damaged, and he'd left to join the Rangers shortly after. "Why didn't you tell me?" Violet demanded. Your father forbade it, Aunt Martha said simply. And by the time he passed, 2 years had gone by. What good would it have done? Violet spent the next 2 weeks processing this revelation while caring for her aunt. She wrote several letters to Kieran but tore each one up, unsure what to say or how to apologize for her father's actions. June arrived, bringing scorching heat that turned Crimson Creek into a dusty oven. Violet had just finished hanging laundry in the yard when she spotted a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Kieran dismounted at the gate, removing his hat as he approached. He looked tired, his face sunburned from days in the open range. "Miss Reed," he greeted her formally, aware of the neighbors who might be watching. "Mr. O'Malley," she replied, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and hair loosened by the breeze. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "Finished earlier than planned." He hesitated. "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to the social at the town hall tomorrow evening." Violet blinked in surprise. The monthly social was Crimson Creek's main event: dancing, food, and community gossip all wrapped into one evening. "You want to escort me? After everything my family did to you?" Kieran's expression hardened. "So you've heard." "Aunt Martha told me." "I'm so sorry, Kieran. What my father did was your father's doing, not yours," he interrupted. "I never held you responsible." "But the town will talk if you're seen with me." A wry smile crossed his face. "Let them. I've faced worse than wagging tongues." Against her better judgment, Violet found herself agreeing. The next evening, she wore her best dress, a pale blue creation she'd brought from Boston, and waited nervously on the porch. Kieran arrived promptly at 7, looking transformed in a clean black suit and white shirt. He'd trimmed his hair and shaved closely, revealing the strong line of his jaw. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he helped her into the wagon he'd borrowed. The social was already in full swing when they arrived. Conversation faltered as they entered, and Violet felt the weight of every stare. "Ignore them," Kieran murmured, guiding her with a light touch at the small of her back. They joined the dancing, and for a few precious minutes, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Kieran moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days on horseback, and Violet found herself remembering why she'd fallen for him years ago. "Why did you never marry Sarah Williams?" she asked during a pause between dances. Kieran's expression darkened. "There was no engagement, despite what you might have heard. But I received an announcement, her father's doing, not mine," Kieran said firmly. "He wanted to secure my land adjoining his. When I refused to sell, he tried to force my hand by announcing an engagement that never existed." Violet processed this information as they moved to the refreshment table. "I saw you with her by the creek that day. She was crying over losing her mother's locket. I was comforting her, nothing more." He handed her a cup of punch. "I tried to tell you, but you'd already left town." The evening progressed with increasing tension. Violet noticed Sarah Williams herself watching them from across the room, her expression thunderous. Whispers followed them everywhere, growing louder as the night wore on. Finally, when Kieran excused himself to speak with the sheriff, Mrs. Williams approached Violet directly. "You have some nerve showing your face with him," she hissed. "I believe that's between Mr. O'Malley and myself," Violet replied evenly. "You ruined everything when you came back," the woman continued. "Sarah would have been his wife by now if you'd stayed gone. From what I understand, that was never going to happen." Mrs. Williams's face contorted with anger. "You Reeds think you're better than everyone. Your father was a thief and a liar, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The accusation struck Violet like a physical blow. "My father made a terrible mistake, but a mistake," Mrs. Williams laughed harshly. "He deliberately framed O'Malley to get him out of your life. Everyone knows it." The room had fallen silent, all eyes on their confrontation. Violet felt her chest tighten as she looked around at the judgmental faces. Without another word, she hurried for the exit, fighting back tears. Outside, the night air was cool against her flushed skin. She'd made it halfway down the street when Kieran caught up to her. "Violet, wait." "You should go back inside," she said without turning. "I'm sorry I agreed to come. It was a mistake." Kieran gently turned her to face him. "The only mistake was letting you leave 5 years ago without fighting for you." "My father tried to have you hanged," Violet whispered, horrified. "Because of me." "Your father was a complicated man with his own demons," Kieran said, "but that's in the past now." "How can you say that? How can you even look at me?" "Because I never stopped loving you," he said simply. "Not for one day in 5 years." The confession hung in the air between them, startling in its honesty. Before Violet could respond, a commotion from the town hall interrupted them. Sarah Williams stormed out, followed by her mother. "There you are, you snake," Sarah shouted, marching toward Kieran. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" "Sarah, that's enough," Kieran warned, stepping slightly in front of Violet. "You promised me," Sarah screamed, her face contorted. "You said once she was gone, I never promised you anything," Kieran cut her off sharply. "And I'm tired of your family spreading lies." The confrontation attracted onlookers from the social, and soon a small crowd had gathered on the street. Violet wanted nothing more than to disappear, but Kieran kept a steady hand at her elbow, anchoring her beside him. "Everyone knows what her father did," Sarah continued venomously. "And now she's back to finish ruining you." "That's not true," a new voice intervened. Sheriff Taylor stepped forward from the crowd, "and I think it's time the whole truth came out." The sheriff looked uncomfortable but determined. Jacob Reed didn't frame Kieran O'Malley alone. He had help from the Williams family who wanted O'Malley's land that bordered theirs. A stunned murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Williams turned pale. "That's a lie," she sputtered. "Got a signed confession from your ranch hand Peterson last month before he died of consumption," the sheriff continued implacably. "Said you and Williams cooked up the scheme together. Reed took the blame when it all went south because he was already dying of the cancer that took him." Violet felt as though the ground had tilted beneath her. "My father knew he was dying when he accused you," Kieran nodded slowly. "I found out later he'd been given 6 months. Took the blame to protect you from the scandal, I reckon." The revelation changed everything Violet had believed about her father's actions. He hadn't acted out of malice toward Kieran, but from a misguided attempt to protect her from what he perceived as a fortune hunter after their land. As the crowd dispersed and the Williams women retreated in disgrace, Kieran led Violet away from the commotion. They walked in silence until they reached the creek that gave the town its name. In the moonlight, the water shimmered like liquid silver. "This is where I last saw you before you left," Kieran said softly, "right here by Crimson Creek." "I was so hurt that day," Violet admitted. "I thought you and Sarah." "There was only ever you," Kieran interrupted gently, "even when you were gone." "Why didn't you write to me?" "I did. Dozens of letters. Your father returned them unopened." He sighed. "By the time I learned he'd been intercepting our correspondence, you'd been gone almost a year. I figured you'd made a new life." Violet shook her head in disbelief. "All this time wasted because of lies and misunderstandings." "Not wasted," Kieran corrected. "We've both grown, learned things, became people who might build something stronger now." The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Crimson Creek. The Williams family's deception became the new scandal, eclipsing any gossip about Violet. Slowly, the townspeople began to treat her differently, with curiosity rather than contempt, and eventually with cautious acceptance. Kieran called on Violet properly, taking her on buggy rides and walking with her after church on Sundays. They rediscovered each other as adults, sharing stories of their time apart and dreams for the future. Aunt Martha watched their courtship with knowing eyes. "Your mother would be pleased," she told Violet one evening. "She always liked that boy." By late summer, Violet had received an offer to teach at Crimson Creek's small schoolhouse. She accepted, realizing she no longer wished to return to Boston. The town that had once driven her away was becoming home again. On a warm September evening, Kieran took her riding to the ridge overlooking the valley. As the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, he asked her to be his wife. "I've loved you since we were 18, he said, holding her hands in his. "I aim to love you till my last breath." Violet's answer was unhesitating. Yes, they married in October when the aspen trees had turned to gold. The ceremony took place in the same church where Violet had once cried alone, but this time the pews were filled with well-wishers. Even old Mr. Hollister from the general store attended, presenting them with a silver serving set. Kieran had purchased land on the eastern edge of town and built a modest house with his own hands. On their wedding night, he carried Violet across the threshold as was tradition. "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Malley," he whispered against her hair. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. Violet taught at the schoolhouse while Kieran raised horses, developing a reputation for producing the finest stock in the territory. When not working with horses, he occasionally assisted the sheriff, his skills as a former ranger proving valuable in maintaining peace. The following spring brought news that Aunt Martha's health had improved enough that she could travel. She decided to visit her sister in California, leaving on the stagecoach with promises to return for Christmas. "Never seen Martha so spry," Reverend Collins commented after church one Sunday. "Must be the joy of seeing you two so happy." By their first anniversary, Violet was expecting their first child. The whispers in town now were of a different sort, admiring Violet's strength in returning to face her past, praising Kieran's successful horse breeding business. "Funny how things change," Kieran remarked as they sat on their porch one evening watching the sunset. "A year and a half ago, you were crying in the back of that church while they whispered about you. And then a handsome cowboy sat beside me," Violet finished with a smile, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Changed everything." "I'd say we changed it together," Kieran replied, placing his hand over hers. Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning in 1873, Catherine Martha O'Malley, named for Kieran's mother and Violet's aunt. The entire town celebrated her arrival, with even Mrs. Preston bringing a handmade quilt as a peace offering. As the years passed, their family grew. A son joined them 2 years later, followed by twin girls in 1877. Kieran's horse business prospered, and Violet eventually became the headmistress of Crimson Creek's expanded school. The town itself transformed around them. The railroad arrived in 1880, bringing new residents and opportunities. The old church was replaced with a larger structure, and electric lights eventually replaced gas lamps on Main Street. Through it all, Kieran and Violet remained constants in the community. On Sundays, they sat in the front pew of the church where they'd reconnected, surrounded by their children. The whispers that had once caused Violet so much pain were long forgotten, replaced by stories of the O'Malleys' enduring love story. On their 20th anniversary, Kieran surprised Violet by taking her back to Crimson Creek, which was now a peaceful meadow outside the expanding town. "Remember when I found you crying in the church?" he asked, holding her close as they watched their children playing by the water. "How could I forget?" Violet replied. "I thought my life was over that day. Instead, it was just beginning." "Best decision I ever made," Kieran said, sitting next to a crying woman while everyone whispered. "And the bravest," Violet added, resting her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for being brave enough for both of us that day." As twilight descended, they gathered their children and headed home, leaving footprints along the banks of the creek that had witnessed both their heartbreak and their healing. The whispers had long since faded, but the love that began with a simple act of kindness in a small town church had only grown stronger with each passing year. In Crimson Creek, they still tell the story of the woman who returned in disgrace and the cowboy who defied the town to sit beside her. Some say it's just a romantic legend, but the O'Malley descendants know better. They keep the letters Kieran and Violet wrote to each other over the decades, yellowed with age but filled with a love that transformed not just 2 lives but an entire community. And occasionally, when the light is just right, visitors to the old church claim they can almost see them there, a crying woman and the cowboy brave enough to sit beside her, beginning the journey that would last a lifetime.